We are back on the Zero Hour. I am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And right around this time, depending on when you're listening to this, either today or in the last few days, I will say, this country celebrated a birthday. And here to talk about that with us now is my very good friend, Rebecca Vallas. Rebecca is a senior fellow with the Century Foundation, and I believe she specializes in social insurance. She certainly knows a lot about it. And so without further ado, Rebecca Vallas, welcome back to the Zero Hour.
RJ, it's a total pleasure anytime I get to talk with you, and happy birthday to the Supplemental Security Income Program, better known as SSI.
So why, first of all, if SSI isn't shy about revealing their age, and they shouldn't be because we're not an ageist society around here, how old is SSI? What is it? Where'd it come from?
So I think we should probably start with what is it, because SSI it's that part of our social security system that everyone always forgets about. Everyone's familiar with Social Security retirement benefits. Folks are generally familiar with Social Security disability insurance benefits. Possibly survivor's insurance is something folks are familiar with. But there's this little mini part of Social Security called supplemental security income. And it was signed into law 50 years ago. So the birthday it's having right now is its 50th. And it was signed into law by President Nixon, of all people, in 1972. And the intent behind the program, when Congress established it on a bipartisan basis back in the 70s, was to ensure that disabled and older adults would, quote, no longer have to subsist on below poverty incomes. That was the idea. And hopefully that's a goal we can all get behind, right? That no seniors, no people with disabilities should ever have to live in poverty. I would go a little farther and say no one should ever have to live in poverty.
Right.
Which is kind of on earth. But this program was targeted to specifically seniors and people with disabilities with very, very, very low incomes and very limited resources. So today, 50 years later, and now we're celebrating its 50th birthday on October 30th. That's the actual day this year of the anniversary. Today, SSI provides really, really critical survival income to about 8 million people with disabilities and seniors, and about 1 million of those people are actually disabled children and their families. So I learned a lot about this long forgotten part of our social security system back when I was a legal aid lawyer representing people who were having trouble accessing these critical survival benefits. But RJ, I have to say, excited as I am to talk with you about how much we had to celebrate about SSI's 50 years, it's actually a really bittersweet anniversary because the program's been forgotten by federal policymakers for almost as long as it's been around. And that means that despite the goal of the program, the outdated eligibility rules, like decades old asset limits, decades old income limits, they're trapping people with disabilities and seniors in deep and enduring poverty when the program was actually intended to provide a lifeline out. And just because the program hasn't been kept up to date over the 50 years, even with inflation. So that's some of what we have to talk about as we celebrate this birthday, RJ.
Okay, good points, Rebecca. So thank you for that. But let's talk about that word supplemental for a second. So somebody might be disabled, or they might be a senior. Let's start with the seniors. Let's say someone's a senior, not working anymore. Perhaps they're on Social Security, but it could be that because of their lifetime level of income, or perhaps they were a caregiver for a long period of their work, for any variety of reasons. It may be that their Social Security income, whether disabled or, in this case, I'm talking about seniors, leaves them deeply impoverished, right? So the purpose of this, when it was created, was to take, for seniors, was to take people in that situation and give them at least a livable level of income, and roughly the same for the disabled, whether they're on, and I'm saying all this like I know, but I'm basically just running a by for the disabled if they're on some low level of state disability or other disability insurance, even if they have something coming in, if they're Social Security disability, if it's not enough to lift them out of poverty, the purpose of this program is to provide supplemental insurance that does that, right? Have I got all that right?
And we should dig into a few of those points, RJ, because some of what you said is so important, particularly when it comes to seniors who are receiving very little in Social Security. But despite the name supplemental, for most people today, 50 years after this program was created, and a lot has changed about the economy in those 50 years, most people who receive SSI today, particularly most disabled people, are actually receiving it as their sole or their primary source of income. And that's part of why so many of the people who receive SSI are living well below the poverty level, even the austere, outdated federal poverty level we have in the United States, which we know doesn't even capture what it costs to afford a basic standard of living today. And actually, the maximum SSI benefit in 2022 is just $841 per month, which is about 3/4 of the federal poverty level. So for the vast majority of beneficiaries who don't have anything else, they're living below the federal poverty line, and they're actually trapped there. They're stuck there because if they earn anything else, their benefits get reduced by those outdated rules I was talking about that haven't kept pace with inflation, limits
Yeah.
a ceiling on economic well-being. But seniors, there's a little bit of a slightly different picture for the couple of million seniors who receive SSI benefits. For seniors, more of them are receiving it as a supplement to Social Security. And it's a lot of folks who, as you were describing, maybe they were underpaid and very low wage throughout their working years. And so they don't have a very robust Social Security retirement check to fall back on. Or in a lot of cases, it's actually women who didn't work and didn't develop work credits before we saw a major shift in the labor force, where we saw women's labor force participation catch up to men's. And so those are some of the folks who end up receiving SSI in retirement. But there's also a lot of folks who their disability actually started earlier in life. And so it means they don't have a chance to develop a substantial work record in some cases if their health got in the way. So those are some of the folks who end up receiving SSI, whether for all or most or some of their income. But for seniors, like you were talking about, I mean, actually the picture for seniors is part of what's most outrageous about how badly Congress has neglected this critical program that people use literally to pay their rent and put food on the table and afford copays on needed medications so they're not cutting pills in half, right? Like that's the kind of stuff that people use SSI for. For seniors who receive small amounts of Social Security and then a little bit of SSI to top them up, the SSI rules, these income rules that haven't been updated for inflation since 1972, when the program was started, they cap you at having any outside source of income that isn't quote unquote earned, meaning not from earnings, at $20 a month. $20 a month. That was set in 1972 and it hasn't changed, not a dollar for inflation in 50 years. And so what that means is that seniors receiving Social Security who are supposed to be topped up by SSI are actually not even getting all of their Social Security benefits because they're getting their benefits cut by inflation erosion. And so that is some of what we're now hearing as a real groundswell from advocates across the seniors community, the disability community. This isn't just your average anniversary where people are saying, yay, let's celebrate SSI. What you're actually seeing something of a reckoning and a call to action that it is past time for Congress to remember this program exists and to start to bring it into the 21st century so that we're no longer trapping millions of disabled and older people in this country in deep and enduring poverty that Congress never intended.
So this program, Social Security itself, was created and designed to adjust to inflation, to rise with inflation. And you and I know there have been political battles over how to calculate that and attempts to recalculate it in ways that would give short shrift to people receiving Social Security. But at least it is adjusted for inflation. This year, we're going to see the largest increase in quite some time, in decades, some 8.7%, if I recall correctly. But you're saying that this program was not designed this way, that Congress voted a dollar amount in 1972, when $50 was probably real money, to people. And so there sounds like there are two problems, really. One is that it's urgent that that figure be changed at a minimum. It seems very low anyway, So at a minimum, it should be updated for inflation and then pegged to inflation, you would think, right? But it seems to me also, as I say that, Rebecca Vallas, that I may be going about it backwards too, because it may be that the real thing we should be doing is saying, what does it take to make sure that people, disabled people, seniors, the populations addressed by this do not live in poverty and live in comfort. And maybe that's something else. Maybe even doing everything I described would not reach that goal. But it seems to me that this program, designed with the noble purpose of what you're saying, it's been politically forgotten, and it's now, as a result, failing.
That's exactly right, RJ. And it doesn't have to be this way. That's the thing. It's a choice. It's a simple act of Congress and a flick of the pen, and all of a sudden, millions and millions and millions of our poorest citizens end up in a place where they finally have some level of stability and some level of freedom, right, to go about their lives. So, part of how I think about this, RJ, before we get into the nuts and bolts of how you address inflation and the policy, because sometimes folks' eyes glaze over when they start to hear about that. Oh, we're talking policy. And boy, am I guilty of going straight to talking about policy. I feel like it's worth zooming out a little bit and acknowledging we are not only still living through a pandemic, which is not over, and that is worth saying out loud as often as
Right, absolutely.
But we're also living through a mass disabling event. It is the largest mass disabling event in modern history in this country. And that's in the form of millions of folks with long COVID, which we still
Right.
don't understand, many of whom are finding themselves newly disabled. And as President Biden declared last year, folks with long COVID that is significant and disabling are disabled under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so I just want to acknowledge, as we are living through that mass disabling moment, it's an invitation for a paradigm shift, right? It's an invitation to reinterrogate our social contract. And that is the conversation we should be having as a nation across every aspect of our social fabric, which includes our public policies. But it's an invitation not to return to normal, right? We have all these people saying, oh, can we return to normal? Are we back to normal yet? And normal isn't where we should be questing to go, right? As Sonia Renee Taylor, a poet and activist that I consider to be a modern day oracle, has so beautifully put it, the COVID pandemic is a moment to realize that normal never was. Apart from
Right.
the fact that normal normalized a parade of social ills like hate and greed and lack and inequity and all of these things. So as we collectively and should be collectively interrogating America's social contract and who it is and isn't working for, the way I like to think about how to embrace a moment like this is to step into the mode of asking yourself, what kind of system would you design to be there for yourself and for your family members and for your loved ones if you become disabled or you don't have enough in old age to retire? Would you set up a system that bars emergency savings, that penalizes you for marrying the person you love, that punishes you if you get financial help from loved ones to be able to eat, that
Right.
doesn't bring you all the way to the federal government's incredibly outdated poverty line like we were talking about? I suspect that's not what many of us would design for ourselves or for people that we care about. But until we take action to reckon with the fact that we have let SSI wither on the vine and become that program that I just described, that is what we as a society are tacitly saying is just fine for 8 million of our disabled and older neighbors. And that's the conversation that we need to have as SSI turns 50.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said, Rebecca. And I also think, well, a couple thoughts. Number one, about COVID. The last figures I saw said that as of now, an estimated 4 to 5 million people are out of work with long COVID. I also saw separately a study that said that some 20% of people with long COVID will have it for years, perhaps permanently. That's the latest understanding. Well, if both those figures are correct, we're looking already, and as you say, the pandemic isn't over, at 1 million newly disabled people. And that should be a moment of clarity, right, for us as a country. And your description of, what program would we design for ourselves if we were designing something like Social Security, a supplemental security income today, is so well said. I mean, in a sense, perhaps we should be thinking of it as a mirror that we hold up to our own society. And what that mirror shows us today is neglect of those in need, stinginess, and a kind of, conservatives are always talking about the nanny state or whatever, but the worst kind of intrusive, disrespectful, wait a minute, somebody gave you a candy bar, I better, as opposed to the respect that we should be giving to people on this program as fellow human beings, to say, we want you to be out of poverty and we want you to live your best life. That's just a thought to reflect on before we go into the details. You agree?
Beautifully said, RJ. It's a mirror, and it's one that should show us something right now that no one should be proud to see. And we all are implicated, right? We're all implicated, whether or not we're members of Congress who actually have the votes. I want to acknowledge that one of the most significant and most important and positive evolutions in American society's treatment of disabled people and seniors over the past century is a movement that some people call deinstitutionalization, the large-scale freeing of huge numbers of people with disabilities and seniors from oppressive and isolating and dangerous institutions, which I should also acknowledge today still warehouse far, far too many people with disabilities and seniors because of how many people are languishing on waiting lists, because we have still not made the investment that this nation needs to make in home and community-based services. But as I acknowledge that, and as we acknowledge all the good that SSI has done in many people's lives, it's also important as we mark 50 years of this program and all of the erosion that has gone on over time as it's been neglected, as we've been describing, RJ. In a lot of ways, SSI has become the new form of large-scale institutionalization for people with disabilities and seniors, but it's an institution without walls because of the rules and outdated eligibility rules, like $2,000 asset limits. Can't have a dollar more than $2,000 in the bank, right? Or income limits that you have to live in between, right? Not being able to get married, all the things we've been talking about, all these outdated eligibility rules that beneficiaries have to live inside in order to maintain survival income and health insurance. It's really become a new kind of large-scale institutionalization that's invisibly keeping millions of people with disabilities and seniors not only from full participation in American society, but from living lives with full human dignity and access to the American dream. And so that's the reality for folks that have been out of sight, out of mind for far too long. And as we hold up that mirror, RJ, that you beautifully invoked, that is the image that is staring back at us about how we are treating people who share our common humanity, even if it's being ignored with how this program has been treated by Congress.
And people who at any moment any one of us might become, right? Rebecca, up until now, we haven't gotten into the politics of how we got where we were, but I've gotten the sense that this is mostly a matter of political neglect. Is it, or is there something else in the mix too? Is there hostility to spending more? Is there do politicians feel there's no payoff in advocating for this program? Do conservatives just hate government and want to beat it up? Or is it just off the radar entirely, and the people on SSI are forgotten?
Yeah, it's easy, RJ, to say that somehow forgetting about a program like this and failing to keep it up to date is, oh, it's an oversight, right? It must be just an oversight by Congress because this is a small program, relatively speaking, and relative to Social Security. I think you could call it a small program. But that being said, inaction is a choice. Right. We don't see inaction when it comes to extending tax breaks for wealthy
Right.
corporations the end of the year, right? We see a rush to do, quote, must pass legislation, right? A concept in Washington that means the bills that have to be taken up and passed because there are choices made about whether certain legislation will move and whether other legislation will stay on the shelf. And for years and years and years, Democrats have been introducing something called the SSI Restoration Act, which would just restore SSI to its original purpose, let alone reinterrogate what kind of a program we might build if we were actually trying to think about what it looks like to ensure that no disabled people and no seniors are ever having to live on sub-poverty level incomes in a meaningful way. That being said, unfortunately, we haven't really seen even interest among Democrats in prioritizing this enough, right? You saw disability advocates banging on the walls trying to get into the Build Back Better Act when that was coming together. And that was the high watermark of Democratic prioritization. And yet to even include something that costs as little, relatively speaking, right, within the federal government's budget, as updating, say, SSI's asset limits would cost, even that was a fight. So I don't know that either party is doing a great job right now of remembering how important the program's function is as part of our social fabric. That being said, we are seeing some glimmers of hope. We are seeing growing bipartisan momentum and honestly, lots of business support as well, and employer support, and even support among some of the conservative think tanks in Washington that I don't agree with much on most things, right? That is how common sense it has become at this point to just start bringing SSI into the 21st century. Now we're actually seeing the likes of the American Enterprise Institute. Andrew Biggs recently wrote an op-ed for Forbes saying, this is something we can all agree on, and there's bipartisan interest in updating SSI's asset limits. When I agree with Andrew Biggs on something, I think it's fair to say, and he is no liberal. For anyone who's not familiar with Andrew Biggs' role, he's one of the standard bearers of privatizing Social Security. But when he and I agree on something, and so does J.P. Morgan Chase, and so does the Niskanen Center, who's a libertarian spinoff from Cato. I mean, the number of kind of strange bedfellows who are now getting behind the push to at least start updating SSI's asset limits and income limits for inflation, which is such a bare bones kind of first step, right? At least we're starting to see serious bipartisan conversation there. So I'm crossing all of my fingers and all of my toes, which you can't see on screen, that as Congress comes back in the end of year, sometimes called lame duck session, to do those must pass, I put that in scare quotes, bills, as they always do, that SSI asset limits are at least on Congress's radar. And there is a bill championed by Sherrod Brown from Ohio and Rob Portman, also from Ohio. So the Ohio senatorial dynamic duo. And they've got the likes of Senators Cassidy and Wyden and Scott and Collins and Casey and a whole bunch of bipartisan senators on that bill with them. What it would do is update SSI's asset limits, stuck at $2,000 since 1984, the year I was was born, actually, updating that number for inflation, so that people can at least build some kind of emergency savings and do a little bit of planning for the future, even though it's not eliminating the asset limit, which frankly is what Republicans and Democrats alike would agree would be the good policy to do here. So that bill is a great first step, and we are seeing huge bipartisan momentum for potentially including it in an end of year package. That's not going to happen inevitably, as Dr. King reminded us in his letter from the Birmingham jail. Progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability, and that is why it's only going to be continued action by calling members of Congress and sending letters and emails, all the things that disability and seniors advocates have been doing across the country, and that SSI beneficiaries have been doing across the country for months and months. That is the kind of action it's going to take for this to be something that makes it into the otherwise must pass vehicles. But it's what's giving me a little bit of hope right now, as RJ, as we have this SSI at 50 conversation.
So that would be a big help, obviously, raising the asset limits in terms of the cost of the program, relatively fractional, right? I mean, it wouldn't be a massive increase in the cost of the program. Quick nerdy question: does it? We know that Social Security, people pay into trust funds for Social Security, so there are earmarked funds or designated funds for Social Security. We don't have to get into the economic debate about that, but we know that's the case. Is SSI funded through general revenues or something else? I have a reason for asking, but
it's a great question, RJ, and it's often one of the questions that I actually get from Hill staff when they're trying to figure out how to think about the where their boss wants to stand on a bill like this.
Right.
Because people know so little about SSI, they confuse it with some of the Social Security programs that are funded by the trust fund. No, SSI is not funded from the trust fund. It is general revenues, and that's because it's to protect folks who don't have the work record to be protected by Social Security's insurance fund. And so that is the nerdy answer to your nerdy question. And now I'm curious why you asked.
And the reason why I asked was because normally Republicans in particular are extraordinarily reticent to pay anything for social benefit out of general revenues. It's just they don't want. I mean, they also want to cut Social Security, but so for such a mixed crew of Republicans as well as Democrats supporting this, raising the asset limit, that says a lot about some level of political support for the program. But it seems to me that that's, if not, perhaps not even half the battle. It's certainly only part of the battle, right? Because the other part of the battle, and the costlier part, I would think, is shouldn't the benefits themselves, what people receive, be increased? If people are being left in poverty, don't we need to significantly reassess and, adjust upward the amount of money people are getting on this program?
That's exactly right, RJ. So there's what we might be able to do within the near future that we think might be within the Overton window, as it's some called.
Yeah.
And then there's what we actually need to do right by people as human beings. And that is not necessarily all within the realm of what would be politically possible today or even possibly tomorrow, which hurts my heart deeply, but also is the reality in Washington, D.C., where outsized power is held. So, you ask the American people, what do you want to see happen? Well, they want to see SSI's benefits increased, and that's true among Republicans and Democrats. Huge majorities of Republicans and Democrats want to see SSI's asset limit at least increased or possibly eliminated, right? You see huge support for that across party lines. You see huge bipartisan support for eliminating the marriage penalties, for updating the income limits, all the things we've been talking about. And that's true whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent. I mean, the polling we have done on this, it is off the charts, right? You just don't see this kind of support in especially in income assistance programs. And so when it comes to updating SSI's woefully, woefully low benefits. That's something that President Biden has called for doing as well. And in fact, he campaigned on increasing SSI's 3/4 of the federal poverty line benefit up to at least the federal poverty line, to say, at least let's protect people from what we define as poverty in the US today. We saw multiple candidates for president in the 2020 primary, Democratic candidates, I should note, actually go farther than that, like Senator Bernie Sanders, who said, let's bring SSI up to 150% of the federal poverty line. All of these things are, I think, great proposals to put out there. And yet, let's be honest, none of them are fully adequate to what people
Right.
actually to be able to meet their basic human needs. And it is expensive to be disabled, which is a thing that may not be familiar to folks who haven't lived with disability. But there are about $18,000 to $19,000 in additional costs on average that a family with a disabled member face, just because of the additional costs of living with disability. So all that to say, we need to be shooting much, much higher as our North Star. But in terms of what the proposals are that are out there right now in vehicles like the SSI Restoration Act, or what we've seen President Biden commit to, the current conversation is around, let's at least, as the bare minimum, bring these benefits up to America's current federal poverty level, so that we can at least say people deserve, as Congress said in 1972, not to be living on below poverty incomes. So that's the step in the direction that that we should all be seeking to head. But as any SSI beneficiary will tell you, that's not going to be enough either. And that's why, as we think about 50 years of this program, it is actually really important for us to not just think about what's going to be possible to do in the near term, but what is the vision? What is the vision for our social contract that doesn't leave huge numbers of people in deep and enduring poverty? Because we know we can do better, and we know it wasn't small and politically possible goals that created programs like Social Security back in the New Deal.
Absolutely, and we would be remiss not to talk about what people can do about this issue, because you and I both know, number one, that our elected representatives, many of them want to do the right thing, but nothing moves them or motivates them more than calls, emails, other forms of contact from their constituents saying, I want this done. I want this done now. Believe me, if you've worked in Washington, as I know you have, it's amazing what a flood of calls can do on a subject. So that's one thing. And of course, activism is critical here. So other than calling your representatives on this incredibly important issue, is there anything else people can do? Organizations they can support, places they can go for more information, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think the thing that people need to know is, if they're calling their representatives, the piece of legislation to ask them to support and to include in end of year legislation, don't let this Congress go by without passing this bill, is the ask. The bill is called the SSI Savings Penalty Elimination Act, and it's sponsored by Senator Sherrod Brown and Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, and that's the bill. RJ, I feel like as we head into these midterms, I'm just really reflecting on the fact that people with disabilities are just such an underappreciated voting bloc. 1 in 4 Americans live with disabilities today, numbers that are only rising because, as we were talking about before, we are living through a mass disabling event, the likes of which we still don't know yet what scale will look like. And yet, people in Washington almost never say, oh man, I wonder what people with disabilities are going to think if I do X, right? It's just, they might think about seniors, they might think about certain
Right.
people with disabilities haven't really registered. And we did a little bit of polling at the Century Foundation in partnership with Data for Progress earlier this year. And what we found was people with disabilities are noticing how forgotten they are by Washington. We found that just 3 in 10 disabled voters believe that people in Washington care about people with disabilities. So SSI and its neglect is just the poster child of why people with disabilities feel so left behind and underrepresented. So I say that as we head into these midterms, and as folks think about, is it your own experience of disability? Is it someone you know? Is it someone in your family? We all have some connection to the disability community, and that enough is a reason to reach out to your member of Congress and say, are you aware of how badly SSI has been neglected? Are you supporting the SSI Savings Penalty Elimination Act? What are you doing to, in this moment, before this Congress is out, before this year is out, actually starting to, what are you doing to make sure that we as a country start to take steps towards ensuring that the people that this program was put in place to help are being treated as fully human? It's a human rights issue at this point. So that is my call to folks. This is not an us and them issue. This is an us issue. We are all connected to this in some way or another. And it's a moment to reflect on what our connections are and what we can do to be part of the change.